Welcome to the Weekly Squeak, your weekly geeky squeak with me, Christian Chiller. And my usual weekly roundup of links and an interview. I have an interview this week, actually with someone a little bit different, my old co-host, Cate Lawrence. We're going to be discussing IoT, we're going to be discussing tech trends in 2020, and we're going to be discussing tech conferences and events moving forward. But first, my links for the week. First, there's quite a selection of various different ones here this week. Something on New Statesman from Sarah Manavis. And this is why Goodreads is bad for books. I've been using Goodreads for some time. It's a weird sort of looking site, which is what half the article is about. One of these sites that continues to look slightly outdated and can. For blogging books you've read, trying to get recommendations. I mostly use it just so I know what I've read and what I want to read that people have recommended and things like that, not necessarily for any further recommendations. But as with anything, as this article is mentioning, once something becomes too big, it can almost be too influential on industry and habits of what people are reading. And this is one of the bigger problems of it, in that it's too dominant and it's too impactful. And it's owned by Amazon, which they keep fairly quiet. You can find that if you want to. They keep the Goodreads library and the Amazon kind of thing fairly separated, but of course it gives Amazon a lot of data and helps, I suppose, depending on your perspective, their position in selling books. And this article details a few people trying alternatives that try to be a little less influential on the industry maybe, and just more influential on people's tastes. Obviously, the problem with these sorts of things is many people who've tried to unsettle sites like Facebook and things like that is it doesn't matter how good the product is if no one comes. And I think there are some quite amazing statistics here of the number of users that Goodreads have and some of these sites that have tried to be an alternative. They don't have that many users in comparison, but do they have enough? Do they have enough for what they want to accomplish? I suppose that's the interesting thing. So have a look here. I've looked at, there was a couple of the alternatives I was thinking of. Storygraph, that was it, the Storygraph. 40,000 registered users at the moment, but Goodreads claims, where is it? 90 million. So it's quite, add a few zeros, and it's been around for 15 years, which, you know, it also helps as well. So who knows? We shall see. I think it's interesting that a lot of these sorts of sites for books, movies, TV shows, things like that are, and beers as well. There's not that many of them in each case. There's usually one dominant one and then people who try to usurp that. But maybe it's too much of a minority, and it's only really the connection to Amazon that makes Goodreads keep going, maybe. I don't know if any of the others in the like IMDb and things like that, if they're connected to anybody. I'm not sure. Anyway, if you're interested in Goodreads and looking for an alternative, maybe you should go and have a look at some of the others they mention here. And yeah, let me know your thoughts. Let me know how you go with that. Next, there's actually going to be quite a lot of Microsoft and Windows news in the next Weekly Squeak, because I can see it coming down the line. But for now, in fact, you can also see some of it being hinted at on the more from Liam Tung, the author of this article, on the right-hand side there. But I'm going to focus on one right now from Liam Tung on ZDNet. Windows 10 gets Apple's Swift programming language and Google's Flutter. Actually, I published an article on using Flutter for cross-platform development 2 weeks ago, so you can also have a look at that. Find the link at christianchiller.com. And I mean, I'm actually quite surprised it took so long. Well, yes, last time I looked, the macOS versions of Flutter were in beta, so I guess the Windows ones were non-existent or in alpha. I'm surprised it took so long for Swift. It is, after all, mostly a C compiler and has been available for Linux for some time. But yeah, now Windows developers have other options. I wonder what the experience is like. I've often found that developing on Windows can be a little messy and confusing because you have these multiple different environments and different ways of installing things, whereas Linux and macOS tend to have kind of one terminal environment and one place you put these sorts of libraries and things like that. But we will see. If you've been waiting to experiment with Swift or Flutter and you are a Windows user, then now's the time to try it. They're both quite interesting, cool languages. Some more Microsoft and Google news. This one's slightly different from Emiliano Melino on the UK version of Wired. Google and Microsoft staff set to join the UK's first tech trade union. Tech trade unions are not new. There's quite a few, mostly in the US. Tech is an interesting industry to unionize. And this is focusing mostly on, I suppose, the quote-unquote knowledge workers in the tech industry, not necessarily the people like the Uber drivers who work for Uber and things like that, but the knowledge workers, the ones who are generally in a bigger position of privilege, but for various reasons on both sides of the equation, their own rights, but also them wanting to have a say in how a company may operate. Things like Google and Microsoft getting involved in lucrative military contracts, for example. They feel the need for a union to give them some kind of bargaining discussion power. And generally in the past, I think this is in the UK as well, they have been affiliated with communication workers unions, things like that. But as more and more people become a part of tech industry, and I think there's actually in the UK 9% of the workforce, which is actually quite a lot, with no real formal union is quite interesting. So the UTAW, United Tech and Allied Workers Union, will be that union. I think I will try and arrange an interview with them. It's something interesting to try and hear more. There's actually been a lot of consolidating of various tech bodies in the UK. So maybe it's time to speak to a few of them and find out why, especially in these kind of very, very close to Brexit times. Maybe they're sort of solidifying themselves somewhat more independently. And it mentions here that a lot of union workers tend to be older, whereas tech workers tend to be younger. So there's a lot of interest in things there to see how it will fit with the traditional union movement. And I guess a lot of people could even argue is that, will they be any use to you? Do companies and governments respect unions anymore? We shall see. I think it'll be interesting to see how they go. And I'll try and get them on the show soon. One more bit of Google news. This is an interesting article I found on the Analytics India mag, slightly niche publication from Sujuti Das. Did Google open sourcing Kubernetes backfire? I found this an interesting post. A lot of people have considered that Google releasing Kubernetes has been definitely good for the ecosystem. Was it good for them? They get to offer cloud services and things like that. But did it go too far? Have they had too many competitors in the space? Has it got out of their control a little bit? And this article actually poses that question. And I find it kind of interesting. AWS is still dominating, mostly making revenue out of something that Google created, as are Azure and IBM and many other companies. So, I mean, they don't really speak to anybody from Google in this company. In this post, it's all conjecture. But it's actually interesting to know, to think about. Sorry, I'm a little bit tired this morning. I wonder how the people behind the decision think. Has it been successful for them? Not sure. It's certainly given them a lot of kudos in the open source ecosystem, but did it give them the business return that they were hopefully asking for? Or maybe they weren't asking for any. Anyway, if you find that interesting, have a read. And yeah, there's a what do you think at the bottom of the article. Leave your comments on their article, and also just let me know your thoughts. You can find my contact details for the podcast at christianschiller.com. Or just leave some comments wherever you have found the show. Another tech, I can't think of the right word, megalith? Not sure if that's actually the right word, but we'll go for it. Now, this is from Fast Company by Harry McCracken. Adobe finally figured out how to make PDFs make sense on a phone. This is reported by several outlets, but I just happened to be picking on this article on Fast Company. At the moment, if you're watching the video, watching a video on the Fast Company website about comfortable pants. Hope you enjoy that. Anyway, Liquid Mode is a new mode that Adobe has been testing for some time. It was actually on the Acrobat Reader on iPad for some time, but every time I ever tried it, it said, doesn't work on this PDF. But they're rolling it out a lot to mobile now. Enabling PDFs to flow on screen sizes of whatever device. I've been trying to try this. I say I haven't had a lot of success. I guess it was an early release and we'll yet to see how successful it will be. But it's quite interesting. PDFs are not dead. A lot of people criticize PDFs, but when PDFs are made properly, they're actually a very good portable document format. See what I did there? And I'm looking forward to seeing if they're claiming it's artificial intelligence. I don't know if that's strictly true. Will help make that format more universal. So you don't have to do like I have to now do as an old man, looking up close to try and read the small text in a PDF, but it'll actually fit my device and font settings. We shall see. I read a lot of highly laid out kind of game books and things like that. So I'm intrigued to see how it works with some of those. Maybe that's why it hasn't worked so far, because I'm reading some very odd sorts of PDFs. But have you tried it? If you have, let me know how it went for you. Next, something actually from about a month ago, Jesse Frizzell on ACM, the American Computing Magazine, something, magazine, yeah. The Life of a Data Byte. This is quite a nice post, relatively long, talking about the history of the data byte from 1951 all the way through to the present and the future of how we store data, the mediums we store data, and the capacity of that storage. So if you've always wondered how we got here, and actually it's quite interesting to see, it feels like what we have now, we've had for a very long time, which is actually sort of true. Many people using computers now have never used CD-ROMs, have never used floppy disks. But actually what we now have is quite new. And the strange thing was that even those things that we had before were also quite new and not with us for that long. And some of the stuff, some of the mediums we use for long-term storage, like tape and things like that, have actually been around for a very long time. Spinning disks and tape have existed for quite some time, and we're still using them. And it's interesting to see what we will use moving forward. There's lots of advances in kind of solid-state drives, which is what most devices are now using. But also I have seen things like storing on DNA, storing on all sorts of organic matter is quite fascinating to see how that evolves over the next few years, mostly for longevity. Solid state drives and things like that are great for using a computer for 5 to 10 years, for example, but not for anything much longer. And they start to break down relatively easily, but they suit the commercial use. But for long-term archiving, not so much. So a lot of the research is sort of around that. And this is quite an interesting article detailing how we got to where we are and where we're going from here. I think my highlight here was, where was it? Somewhere in here. One of the space shuttles. Yeah, in 1969, the Apollo guidance computer stored data on rope, which makes sense when you think about it. It's fairly analogous to vinyl, but of course quite slow. But it lasted. This is the important thing. It lasted the rigors of space. Anyway, quite a fascinating article. If it fascinates you too, go have a read. Next up, an article from Cato S on Medium, Virtual Conferences 2020, a review. This is basically someone just reviewing how they found their experience of remote conferences and some of the extra tips in addition to your normal tips for presenting at conferences on presenting at remote conferences. Things like time zones, looking for global influence, some of the advantages of the accessibility and global reach of virtual conferences, and also the safety of discussion spaces and things like that. So there's kind of tips and advice for organizers as well as speakers in this article, and things like checking over your AV and getting used to talking to nobody, things like that. I've been doing this a lot with these podcasts and live streams, of course. I've been doing it for some time. I've done a few courses in the past as well, so I guess I got a little bit used to it. But there's this weird kind of crossover of live, not live that a lot of these conferences are doing at the moment, where you record a video and then you kind of go to live, which I'm still not sure how I think about that, but that's how a lot of them are doing. But if you're about to deliver one of your first remote conferences, then have a look here and get some advice. And finally, Bess Lovejoy on Mental Floss, the mysterious deaths of 6 historical figures. I love posts like this. If you ever wonder what really happened to Napoleon or to Amelia Earhart or to Edgar Allan Poe, read about their quite mysterious, intriguing deaths, and make up your own minds. So there's one just to go away and have a quiet, intriguing peruse of. That was my links for the week. And now here is my interview with Cate Lawrence, plus special guest Cat every now and then.
Hello, my name is Cate Lawrence. I'm a tech journalist and a writer, and I write about all things to do with technology, from mostly Internet of Things is kind of my backbone underpinning most of what I write about, to things like smart cities, mobility, software, platforms, data monetization, all kinds of stuff.
And anyone who has listened to, not watched the show, actually, no, we did have some video on some of the very early episodes. Anyone who has watched or listened to the show before will actually recognize Cate. She was a co-host some time back. I decided to get her back. I interviewed my old boss a couple of weeks ago, so why not interview my old co-host? Why not? And I wanted to ask Cate a few questions. I wanted to talk about a couple of things. We're going to start with one subject, and that is the IoT/industrial IoT space that you cover a lot. Mm-hmm. So first, I just wanted to ask from the past few months, the past year. I mean, obviously, the past few months have been rather overshadowed by particular events that might have changed things, but you can look further back if you like. Any trends that you think are interesting in IoT, industrial IoT, that you think people should know about and keep an eye out for?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main one, if I'm going to look at home automation, people often think home automation is kind of this like, oh, I can connect my lights with my phone and I don't have to flick a switch. But it should actually be a lot more intuitive than that, which is that it's able to personalize to individual people. The use of AI and IoT is able to provide meaningful data, and so that devices are able to predict and anticipate behavior and the way the home is used, quite simply. I think a lot of that is really coming together. There's been a lot more efforts to standardize and to collaborate, particularly across the challenge of interoperability, which has always been a pain point for the smart home. And there's been a couple of sort of consortiums that have been really leading that. And what I'll do is I'll give you those details in the show notes so people can take a look for themselves, rather than go too much into it. The other one is mobility. I write a lot about mobility. It's actually a really interesting area. And
what do you mean by mobility? Let's just break that down for people who don't know what is mobility.
It's basically how we move people.
That was obvious, but
I focus on people moving. Some people will focus on supply chain and cargo and things like that. But I look at people, how we move people, say, around a space, around a city, whether that's things like aircrafts and flying vehicles, whether that's vehicles that are in process of being developed, like the vertical takeoff landing vehicles that we otherwise call, I think, flying taxis, to things like buses, cars, autonomous cars, or autonomous vehicles of different permutations, trains and public transport, bicycles, e-bikes, different types of, last mile solutions or micro-mobility, which are the smaller kind of devices. So all those kinds of things, how we power those things, how we curate them, how we regulate them, all this kind of stuff. It's actually a super interesting area.
Especially with mobility, has much changed in the past 6 months? I mean, there's an assumption, especially out of the US, that no one went anywhere, which is not really very true. And especially in Europe, people have been moving around a reasonable amount. But how they move around has changed.
Yes and no. I think, firstly, there was a substantial drop in people movement in the first few months of COVID-19. So that the transport providers were losing a large amount of money. That was a significant problem. People have, returned to most transport. Some cities have approached this in different ways, because the challenge of, we know in Berlin, the challenge of peak hour, you might say, I'm going to socially distance on public transport. No one does. You also have the challenge of space, but also things like how do you regulate people wearing masks and stuff like that. So there's been a lot of different efforts by using technology to kind of integrate this. We have everything from in Italy, where they will stagger the workday so that people come and go in transport at different times, and they will actually shut down train stations if there's too many people. We have apps in a variety of different countries that basically will tell you which carriages are full on trains, for example. But they'll also do things like if I know it's, I don't know, 9 a.m. and I'm trying to get to work and I'm at the station and there's no way I can get on this train without compromising social distancing, assuming it's being enforced, of course, it will give me other transport options, whether that's things like an e-bike or a tram or something else. So a lot of that kind of stuff. There's been also a big push about how the technology of cleaning, how we clean things, what kind of surfaces we use, how we use things like UV lights for cleaning, use of robotics for cleaning stations, to things like the really, really big trend in a lot of cities to change how we use the roads. So the fact that we have less people on the roads means it was an opportunity to increase bike paths. Most cities experienced an increase in cycling or people buying bikes. And some of those things may remain. I know there's been more push to keep some streets car-free. So it's been really I think the other thing I'd mention is originally a lot of the kind of micro providers, things like the scooters and the e-bikes, were hit very hard. A lot of them just closed down because the challenge was, well, we don't know what to do, And so they've actually started working on ways to clean them.
Okay, so do you think they were shut down because of hygiene or for other reasons, and it was just a coincidence?
Largely hygiene, and I think some of them were told to, and some of them decided to. So it was partly a business decision in terms of, well, people aren't using them. We don't need to have people going around the streets and recharging e-bikes or what have you, or or collecting them. But it was also just those safety reasons. So there's been a concerted return to that. So even over the last 3 months, we've seen a number of mergers. We've seen, companies acquiring other companies. We've seen an expansion to other cities. So, if it's not a time that transport is dead, because we always need to move around a city. We may be at home more. So the idea of the kind of commute to work has changed for some people, but not all people. And we are still moving around you look at it, you think of most people, I can't quite remember the statistic, but a large chunk of people will only move around under 5 kilometres a day in a radius of where they live, if they're able to live close to work, of course. And then you have the situation of cars, for example. If we do own a car, that's stationary for 95% of the day.
Yeah. It's actually interesting because in a lot of European cities, especially, they were starting to reduce car use, and I think it definitely went up a bit again. Whether that was personal car use or shared car use is I'm not 100% sure. But I definitely saw a lot of the scooters come back and the bikes come back. We had the jump bikes here from Uber, and then they went, and then they came back again, but they're now Lime. Fascinating me was whether they were keeping them the whole time. But anyway,
that's the funny for it. I mean, I think we see people using them, but we don't see as many people using them as in perhaps some of the other cities.
I would disagree with you there, actually. I do see a lot of people using them.
I see less people. It's not those.
I disagree with you. I think we just move in different places. I see people using them a lot.
I would also say that people are. I mean, when we look at these kind of devices, they're mostly used for short distances.
Well, that's the point,
from home to the train station, for example, or to a bar or something like that. As you say.
And the other thing, actually, they did release an app here, Jelby, which I haven't really tried. That is an attempt to cover end to end, which is interesting as well because it's obviously different providers. That's not all the same provider. I don't really know how they're handling that.
Yeah, it's the cross-platform or cross collaboration is pretty much the critical key to all of this. Like we've seen in Berlin, for example, the BVG has had the Konig, which are a kind of little car, a car kind of minibus that you can book on demand. So you have an app, and or you can even phone if you're an older person. And the idea is to have that to augment the need for public transport as a trial. A lot of cities are trialing this kind of stuff.
I haven't seen that be terribly popular, I must admit.
It's
also
actually,
in very
it's
limited
been very
areas.
popular.
Okay.
It's
I always see them driving around and they're all
popular
empty.
with a certain cohort of people who need it. And I think what it may do is make transport more accessible for people who otherwise may struggle to get accessible public transport. Like not all train stations are wheelchair friendly, for example, things like that. The other thing I would mention as well, because I think it's worth mentioning, is the fact that COVID-19, we saw a very large number of bus drivers and infrastructure personnel in public transport die from COVID-19.
Really?
Because, particularly in
I
London.
didn't hear that. Where in particular?
London and New York are the main ones.
Okay.
I have written about it a bit, so I can send you some links or put down in the show notes. Yeah, because they were not protected appropriately in the first few months. And there were also cases that were well documented of people being spat on and things like that, or coughed on, that as a result died. So this idea of, we've seen the temporary idea, which is kind of changing the where the driver sits to have there's some kind of covering. That will be I think that will be a trend that will continue inevitably when people are designing buses. We've seen this also trajectory move to things like taxis. I could see this happening with hire cars.
Well, and especially, I mean, depending on the city, trains, trams, underground trains, you haven't had an interaction with the driver for a long time. Buses, depending on the city, very, very little. Most people these days do not buy tickets from the bus driver. In some cities, London, for example, it's not even possible. So basically all they're doing is driving, and a glorified security guard should they need to be, which does really start to also push them very much in the direction of automation, because all they're doing is, I don't think all they're doing is, sounds negative, but they're just driving now.
Exactly.
Which actually I find, especially, I've seen this in London, especially for the bus drivers. I think they must get very boring, because you don't really interact with anybody anymore. Which is, I mean, not everybody drives a bus because they want to interact with people, but you have all these people constantly going past you and no one ever speaks to you anymore. It's kind of a bit depressing, maybe.
I think this is I still remember the days of trams where you had conductors on trams that would come and buy you a ticket, sell you a ticket, and there was an interaction. They talked to people.
Buses as well. I remember that, buses in London.
Chit-chat, and it was all very convivial most of the time, unless you didn't have a ticket and you got caught or something like that. But it's kind of changing how we use transport. And I think as we move towards automation, the other thing that's going to become really interesting when we look at these vehicles is what we're doing with our time when we're not driving. Like, when you have an autonomous, a bus or a tram or something, it's probably pretty standard. We will see changes though in things like, particularly pertaining to, as we said, COVID-19, doors are going to change. How we open and how we enter and leave vehicles, because the idea of getting everyone to get to one door is kind of crazy. It's more like we may have temperature checks. We're more likely to be using apps, as we said. The other thing I've seen a return of, which I think is kind of funny, because is QR codes. I don't know. I wrote about QR codes a long time
I don't
ago.
think they ever went away, to be perfectly honest with you.
Well,
people
they
always.
were kind of only, when I first started writing about them, they were only really a thing in Europe. And I was writing about, there was one particular use case, which was a woman who made QR codes for nail salons. So basically, you could put the QR code on the nails as they were being painted. And while you were in the salon, you could engage with particular screens. So you could watch a video and engage with it, because a lot of the nail salons in Asia have like video screens and things like that. But there's also an app, so you could do things with your nails. Kind of quirky and weird, but it was always like, there's all these kind of weird uses, and now we're like, oh, now I have to install a QR code reader again. So
I'm going to disagree with you again ever so slightly. QR codes have actually been quite popular for some time. Two-factor authentication, quick links to websites. Google Lens has been built into many Android devices for some time. QR codes have always been treated as this kind of like out of date, slightly daggy kind of technology. But actually, it's used a lot. It's like people diminishing SMS when actually that's also still used a lot. I think it's one of those technologies that people forget is actually quite widely used, and not just in Asia. I mean, I know WeChat, I think, uses Alipay and a lot of the Chinese payment systems use QR codes, I think. But also, two-factor authentication codes, they all use them to begin with anyway.
Yeah, I think the security thing is definitely perhaps the strongest use we've had. The need to secure devices by more than one means. Absolutely.
Now, interestingly, just in good timing, I was about to move on to other things, and the garbage collectors have just appeared outside the window. I don't know if this recording is picking them up, but we'll just carry on.
Not so much.
So that's actually a nice segue into other uses of quote unquote industrial IoT. I mean, there was lots of things happening already in automations of factories and farms and things like that. Has the past few months, with maybe the reduction in wanting people in one place, accelerated any of that development, or not changed very much? Or
it depends who you talk to, basically. I mean, we
it
obviously
depends is generally the answer.
We had a lot of workplaces that had to close, like some of the automobile manufacturers, for example, closed for a month or so. I would say most people are probably back and operational. There is obviously variance depending on exactly where you live, if there's active cases around the precinct or what have you. But I do think that overall we've seen, as if you look at the factory or the industrial space as a metaphor for digital transformation, we've seen that extended to every other workplace now in different permentations. So
let's come back to that in a minute. I'd like to dig into that subject a bit more. Let's just stick with industry and farming for now. I have a slight agenda on the farming aspect because I know certain countries that rely on cheap labour coming from other places have not been able to get access to that labour, and I wondered if they'd replaced it with anything. Or I guess the argument is it's hard to automate things in a few months, no matter how desperate you might be.
Yes and no. I mean, the fact is the technology is there already. There is a lot of technology.
But were they using
automation?
Or are they using it more or less? Or
it depends. Like you said, it depends on the country, and it depends on the actual provider. I mean, the fact is that if we look at the issue of cold chain supply chain from the farm to the shop or what have you.
Sorry, just one sec. What was that? You said supply chain. Before that, you said something else.
From the farm.
Before cold chain.
Cold chain. How you get stuff fresh? How you get fresh things?
Okay.
Like fresh food, or refrigerated food, things like that. These problems are not new. I mean, I've been writing about the use of technology in farming for since 2014. So. We do have robotic pickers, for example, that can pick different types of vegetables and fruits like strawberries or lettuce or what have you. We have the use of sensors and different types of analytics that enable the yield to be greater. And it also means that people can, instead of a farmer using an almanac or something like that, like the very old kind of book that they would use generationally, they're using an app, obviously, or an iPad. Or what have you, and they're able to predict based on the data and the science. What is my yield going to be based on the say it's a grain for one of the example, or the seed? How many lettuces am I going to get? How big are they going to be? When am I going to need them? Based on there's obviously some variance. It's not an exact science, but they will know things like, okay, how many workers do I need? So that they can budget for that. What kind of distribution will I be able to have in the shops? So, how many new markets will I recruit? Or how much will I be able to offer my existing clients? And they all know that basically at a very organic level, that if you look at people in a lot of these trades that people say, oh, they're being taken, the jobs are taken away. People aren't there in the first place. Things like fruit picking and truck driving and, these kind of industries where these are jobs, most of the people are over 50 or older, And as you know, I've talked to a lot of people in ag tech, particularly in the US, and they said to me, the pickers they have, they talk to them a lot, and they say, we don't want our kids doing this. Our kids go to university now. This is not the idea of the sort of humble migrant passing down this menial work because no one wants to do it. It's not entirely true. I mean, yes, there are people that will take the work, like in any industry, of course, like obviously, particularly if you're working a particular occupation for a visa or what have you. But overall, there are many good reasons for automation. And there are also a number of farms that have been automated completely, bar maybe one or two people. I know there was one in the UK and also in Japan and China. And that's before you even look at things like vertical growing and stuff like that, where a lot of the farming for things like microgreens and lettuces and herbs is done inside because it saves water, it saves fertilizers, it reduces the risk of sort of weather problems, things grow faster, things are of better quality, blah, blah, blah. So there's always loads happening.
Well, that's another nice little segue. So you say that people don't want to be doing these manual jobs and they hope there'll be better jobs for their children. And
I think,
a lot of those are probably going to be kind of knowledge based. So I guess some of the workers that had the easier transition in the past few months were people doing that kind of work at a computer.
Definitely.
Maybe or maybe not, having lots of discussions with now there's a siren going past, with a lot of
Can't hear it.
colleagues and things like that. But it was relatively straightforward for them to transition to work from home, and many of them were already doing it. So, casting aside some of the very obvious things, I think a lot has already been written. In fact, too much. Most has been written about some of the very obvious changes and tools and things that people are using for this now and have been using for some time, I would like to point out. And I think the two of us would be happy to point that out. A lot of this stuff is not new.
Yeah. Okay.
What's the word? The amount of people, that's not quite the word I was looking for. The amount of people using is obviously new, and that put those platforms under a lot of strain. But anyway, all that aside, is there anything less obvious that you think has been interesting that people have been using in terms of software, hardware, techniques that has emerged in the past 6 months or so that is different and interesting?
Yes, always. I think perhaps one of the most interesting uses is one of the most disturbing, which is workplace surveillance. We kind of first heard an inkling of this a few years ago, and it was kind of almost like a party trick that journalists would ask their editor to monitor them using a wearable device. And I'd add to you that in a lot of workplaces, in big organizations, there is also always already a voluntary level of wearables monitoring where, for example, people wear a Fitbit. If they get a certain number of steps, they get a reduction in their insurance, their health insurance, for example. But, there's obviously that data is shared with their employer at some level. So we already have this kind of stuff. It's not that new. But what we've seen more due to COVID-19 is those workplaces that weren't used to remote work. So we're not talking about software developers and, tech journalists and people like us. We're talking about workplaces that were probably quite old. Maybe they used old systems. Maybe most of their kind of equipment was on site. It wasn't remote. And they've been very much wooed by this idea of security surveillance. I mean, maybe security is not quite the right word, but the idea that you can use cameras to monitor your workers while they're working to make sure they're working. You can see what screens they're on. You can see how many keystrokes they do in a day. You can have time, and you can time kind of their output, if you like. And whilst we all know, and I think anyone who's even particularly freelancers know, time is not a good measurement of output. Output is the best measurement. Like, what you do in a day, it's about what you get done rather than how long it took you, blah, blah, blah. And so, some of these ideas, you've got to rely on this kind of software being accurate. because it doesn't count things like I might spend time thinking and reading and all very valuable tasks, but I'm not chained to a desk necessarily while I'm doing that. But it also kind of this idea that we work better when we've got someone watching us is pretty ridiculous, and it shows a really fundamental lack of trust in someone's, a manager and their employees. I mean, how do you think that's going to motivate people to work? It doesn't.
Yeah.
It just intimidates them and it frustrates them. And it's also quite insulting, the idea that people in an office are given the autonomy and the time to have chats. They can do kind of, what we call, I guess, the water cooler talk, where you just have a chat while you're making a coffee or whatever. Those kinds of things are okay, but if you're working at home, you have to be switched on and actively working and visibly working the whole time, which we know is not the way humans are. We are valued for being humans because we have these non-automation capabilities, our creativeness and our empathy and blah, blah, blah. But, then you have certain employers that want people to be more kind of automated or what have you. So
it's interesting you mentioned this because it's
a very real problem.
Yeah. It's obviously not a new phenomenon. And neither is the counter to that. I think I read stories about some of the most famous kind of intellectuals in history, Isaac Newton, and I think he's the main example I can think of, would work like 4 or 5 hours a day. And they still managed to produce an amazing amount of materials. But ironically, the time he was around was probably also the time when the I think they used to call it in the UK, time and motion studies and these sorts of things come in around industrialization I mean, I suppose the interesting thing is with industrialization, in theory, the more you work, the more you output. And so whilst I'm not agreeing with it as an idea, just treating humans as a resource to exploit, you can kind of see a correlation. They probably make more mistakes, but they still make more stuff. Whereas in the knowledge economy, you're right that it's not strictly true. You might spend 6 hours thinking and then have an amazing hour of productivity and create loads of benefit to your company. Or you might spend 8 hours working and accomplish absolutely nothing because you've just been faffing around. So I don't know. I mean, do you think that the kinds of companies that have used this kind of technology to monitor their staff were the kinds of companies that would have probably been doing things like that anyway? The kind of boss like looking out the window the whole time to see what their workers were doing, and they're just taking their paranoia to a different place.
Yes and no. I think they probably largely SMEs, so companies that are kind of, they maybe have a small staff that have a lot more work than staff, so there's a lot to do, and they probably think that people they also have a suspicion of the way people work. They're based on the idea that 9 to 5, you come in, you have to sit there, what have you. And I think I'll add one thing. This is maybe another segue to something we were sort of thinking about yesterday. Is how much time you think about it. If you're in think back to, it might take a while, but think back to when you were last in a physical workplace. How much time do you spend in meetings?
Actually, personally, not so much, but a lot of people do, and I always thought that meetings were just like a badge of status more than actual purpose. Yeah, people who pretend to be, well, not pretend, people who act like they're busy all the time as like look how important I am, and actually.
Yeah, and I've one idea I've kind of encountered, which I kind of like, which you probably relate to as someone who works in documentation, is the idea that meetings are no good unless you write things down. We all know that, so that there's actionable outputs and who does what, etc., etc. But if you take that a step further, do you need to have the meeting? Could you have, for example, a collaborative document, even a Google Doc or something, where people are able to collaborate on something and to provide their own input, and etc., and do it in a way that's probably more efficient and more thoughtful. It's that collaborative kind of brainstorming where, because people often say, well, what I'm really going to miss if I'm not in a workplace is that collaborative aspect. of being able to encounter problems together, or and I know how clunky it is. I mean, I've worked on articles with people collaboratively where you literally sit on Skype or some software, and you go through a page of text, or you go through website content, or like the words, and you go through the words like each sentence, and you're trying together verbally to kind of come up with stuff, because sometimes you need to do it a little bit verbally, and sometimes you do it in writing, and it's this kind of ongoing evolutionary process. I think we're going to see a lot more in that area.
I think I'm going to partially agree and disagree with you there. And I think a lot of this comes from the past few months where when there was an option, when there was a choice, everyone said, oh, we don't need to meet in person. We don't need to do this in person. We can do it remotely, work from home, etc., etc. And then it became not a choice for a period of time, and the only option was to work remotely. People realized that working remote, working from home wasn't all it was cracked up to be when it was the only option. And there's a lot of the incidental stuff that it feels like you don't need, but is quite important.
Oh, agree. 100%.
A lot of the time when you have conversations with people, and there's a lot of stuff that's said that is not necessary for the intended purpose, but is necessary for other reasons, kind of human reasons, social reasons, the unintended consequences of saying something that triggers an idea, things like that. Often the written word is easy to misconstrue because you don't see people's feelings around it. I was involved in a conversation yesterday where we had a Slack thread that had gone on and on and on and on and on and not really getting anywhere. And I just said, let's just jump on a call and let's just talk. And we accomplished much more in 40 minutes than we had in weeks of a Slack thread with people misunderstanding each other.
Agree. Yeah.
So I think it's a mix. It's definitely a mix. But I think, interestingly, especially for the people who are always very pro remote working first, et cetera, have realized that it does have a lot of drawbacks. Now being forced into everybody doing it, or a lot of people doing it, we've now realized actually there are some problems with it. And I'm slightly skeptical, and I've mentioned this a few times in the podcast, there's a lot of media, especially coming out of the US, where mostly because that's English language, which is what I'm reading, but also because a lot of people in the US live in large houses with lots of space and setups. This glamour of remote work, when actually for people living in big cities and things like that, it's not glamorous. It's actually quite uncomfortable and isolating and bad for your health.
Absolutely.
And you don't have much separation or much space and things like that. So I think we have realized, I think the change will be in the future. We realize it is possible. If someone says, hey, I'd like to work from home for a week, the boss will not say, well, I got to think about it. They'll say, sure, we know that's possible. And I think that's what will change when people want to do it and the option is there. It's not excluded. And I'm talking medium to long term. Obviously, in the short to medium term, it's going to stay mostly remote for now. But actually, I think more people want to get back to face-to-face work than is alluded to in the media. I think the media is being a little selective on the, possibly because it's mostly written by people who work remotely.
I'd say I'd make a few points there. I mean, firstly, I agree with you. I think it is glamorized by people who haven't done it for a number of years. Particularly if you're in a scenario like many people we know, where you may be in a one bedroom house or a bed sit, where you're trying to navigate with two different people or more people, and try and do things like Skype meetings and calls all day. Extremely difficult. If you're trying to do presentations online, I don't know, anything like that, and you have other people to navigate around, it's very difficult when you can't close a door or there's poor soundproofing or what have you. Then you have people with children. A lot of people are having to try and do childcare or teaching children, which is altogether a different skill at the same time. If you live in cities like New York or London or even parts of Melbourne in Australia or Sydney, you may not even have a living room. You may just have bedrooms because that's the way they set it up to save money or to make money. The landlord make money. So you've got nowhere to go. You're kind of trapped. And that's a really difficult scenario to be in. And then when you've got people that are kind of, experiencing it for the first time, they're like, oh, isn't this great? I can walk from my bed to my couch. And you might say, well, yeah, it's great. But when you don't have room in your bedroom for a desk because your place is so small or what have you. And the other thing I would add, which I think has been really underlooked in the discussion, is for a lot of people, particularly people with disabilities or caring responsibilities, they have been asking for these basic rights for years, even at an educational level, at university, whatever, and told no, it was never possible. You cannot do this stuff remotely. No, we can't do it. And now they're like, well, suddenly, like, you might see your world as being closed because, you can't go out or what have you. My world's finally opened. So now all these things are an opportunity that's open to me. And I think that's something that needs to be very much respected. And I really hope that some of those things will stay open for those people, because it is a lot of people. You think about 20% of the population has a disability at any time. That's a lot of people. And it might be people at home, and they're probably on a low income if they're not working or what have you. So, all these kind of things are fundamentally changing how we live our lives.
Now, let's see there. Kate, do you have a few more minutes? Because I had one other thing I wanted to ask you about, and we're running a little tight on time. I also wanted to ask you, you recently attended. Now, both you and I had attended a lot of events in the past.
Yes.
A large amount of our output, actually. And that's not really been happening. And covering remote events is really not that interesting. It's basically writing about YouTube videos, which is not particularly interesting, I must admit.
True.
So for the first time in about 6 months, you attended a sort of in-person event. And I was quite pleased that it actually happened here in Berlin. It was IFA. So firstly, just for a little bit of background, maybe you could explain what IFA was, and what they did this year differently.
Yeah, absolutely. IFA is basically the German version of CES, the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. So basically, it is an opportunity to go and see consumer tech. You're talking about vendors, you're talking about people doing business deals, you're talking about the public coming and checking it out, you're talking about journalists and analysts and all this kind of stuff. So usually it's a 5-6 day show. There's lots of booze events, there's lots of meetings, there's lots of that kind of touching and, engaging with products that if you're a member of the public, you can't buy stuff. But you can see what the trends are, what's happening. It depends what your interest is. I mean, if you're someone who gets very excited about fridges, you might be like, some of those smart fridges are kind of cool. But then you've got lots of vacuum cleaners as well. Not so exciting. But
rooms full of generic Chinese
and
rubbish.
Can I just add as well? A lot of this is something that often people don't realize, that the issue is now is that we can't have large groups. Yes. We can't have the spread of disease. The fact is that there's been a lot of reports the last few years out of particularly CES and Mobile World Congress of people getting skin conditions, foot and mouth disease, hand foot disease, something like that, from touching a lot of poorly cleaned wearable technology to wearing it, getting head lice, stuff like that. So this is already a problem. And then you've got kind of, the added layer of COVID-19. And we know, as people who go to trade shows and big conferences, people always get sick. Always. Yep. There's lots of people in confined spaces. You've got long hours. You've got lots of walking, because usually they're massive venues.
Can I just quickly add there? The one thing that the past few years really helped me was not shaking people's hands and washing my hands a lot. So actually, it was something I was doing for years that people thought I was weird for doing. Ended up being something that everybody's doing.
You were the soothsayer of the future.
It stopped making me sick. I still got sick.
It's true. I've got really sick before. So basically, to cut a long story short, IFA, what they did this year was they've kind of pulled apart the whole event, and they've kind of picked a few bits that they need to do, and they've spread it over the year. So I went particularly to one event, which was a mobility conference called Shift 2020. So there was a conference, and then there was also some stalls, like stall holders, which I'll explain in a minute. And separately, in a separate building, there was press conferences, which is where you get all the big announcements from, Huawei and NVIDIA and, LG and blah, blah, blah. So there was that separate as well. So I focused really on this mobility conference because I do a lot of writing in that space. And it was a really interesting experience. I mean, firstly, you have the usual caveats of when you go into a conference, you have to get bags checked and all this sort of stuff and ID and all that. Okay, fine. But you also have the judicious, constant use of hand sanitizer. And so if you're going to go around booths, for example, even if they're socially distanced and there's less of them, that's a lot of hand sanitizer, let's face it. So you're going to be less likely perhaps to pick things up. But I would add that most people still had things like flyers and, that kind of stickers and things like that.
That's the delicious ironies of this past few months, of course.
So, I don't know, a few years ago we were being told in the efforts to become paperless that we would indeed just have a QR code and you would download someone's press kit or what have you. And I was often given memory
QR codes, eh? I thought they were outdated.
Yeah, right. And I was often given the ubiquitous USB stick, which of course we all know is something to be avoided because it's very easy to put a virus on it or something like that. So there was that issue. You had harder to navigate around booths and stuff. I mean, that's fine. But then you had the actual conference venue, which was like a large, for sake of argument, a large conference hall. It was very spread out. They radically shifted the numbers from, a few thousand to a few hundred. I
think it was tens of thousands, if more, not more previously.
No, I just mean at this particular conference.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
So you had, very distant chairs. You had one stage with a very large screen, and you could you had to wear a mask except when you were sitting down, which is fine. But so basically what they did, which I think is kind of interesting and worth mentioning this is the approach I would probably recommend to other conferences who have the funding and all that stuff. They had literally a hybrid. So there was the live event. So you could be sitting there, you could see actual speakers, and you could see speakers online. So videos, which yes, we know is not as exciting sometimes. But a lot of the videos, they made a concerted effort to do something different. So for example, there was a woman who was talking about I think she's from Movie, a mobility company in Toronto. I think it's Toronto. And she was literally did a video of walking around her town and showing them the mobility solutions, which is much more interesting than a PowerPoint, let's face it. I mean, we know from making events that a lot of these kind of conference presentations are pre-recorded because it's just good practice. And then what you do is you'll do live questions or live Q&A or panels or something like that. Yep. So there was that kind of thing where you really had an opportunity to do something a bit different. And then you had things on the stage with people talking on the stage. We have people here, we have people there. But what it really did was it really gave a rich diversity to the people who we speak. I mean, we go to a lot of events in Europe. I know when I go to IoT events, I know who's going to be there almost. I know it's because there's a large chunk of people that are always the sponsors. They will always speak. There's always going to be IBM. There's always going to be Microsoft. There's always going to be, NVIDIA, people like that. But what now you have the opportunity to have people from other countries and time zones who ordinarily couldn't make it. So there were people from Africa. There were people from Asia. There were people from Australia. Different, blah, blah, blah. And it really makes a difference to the discussion. You're not just talking about Europe-centric kind of stuff. And, particularly important for mobility because European cities are, maybe not all, but historically based on this kind of, I think the term is medieval idea, the way they're built and, the cobblestones and all that stuff. So it's an opportunity to look at how other cities do things and how they're able to iterate more rapidly. While the cities are active, because, we're not just building tomorrow, we're doing it now for today. So that kind of stuff is really cool. But the other thing the conference did was they also had standalone sessions online. So if you were just doing the online conference, you could also see sessions that only you could see as online people. And then they try and do stuff that maybe works a little bit, but not so much, which I think all the conferences are struggling with, which is, I wrote a white paper about this issue recently, the virtual conference challenges, trying to, firstly, how do we add value to sponsors? So people that want to show their wares or stall holders, those kind of people online, how do we do that? And how do we get people talking to each other? Because we know that we go to conferences to network. And every time, it's without a fact, the most interesting conversations involve those informal chats. It's standing in line for a drink. It's, I don't know, women always chat in the toilets. It's just what women do. It's, waiting for the tram, whatever, And so it's how do we get people feeling like they have that social experience when they go to a virtual conference? What kinds of things can we set up? And there's a lot of really good examples. There's things like, and it's also, I should add, the challenge is if you've been in front of a computer all day watching a conference. Firstly, we know that people aren't going to sit there for 6 hours, because unless you're terribly focused, it's very hard to do. I think for your brain, watching 6 hours of 20-minute talks is very difficult, or 10-minute talks, what have you. And then you've got, I'm often surprised why conferences don't do things like just the audio, so that you can go and do your cleaning or your cooking at home or go for a walk and listen.
I mean, you can just not watch it. I've done that many times, but you do miss a little bit of.
Me too.
Yeah.
But you miss the slides. Sometimes the slides are helpful.
Just as a question, because to be honest with you, IFA is one of the only conferences I've seen who's done this. So for one of the large international events, there's a couple of others, but one of the big, reasonably well-known ones. Did it work? Was it worth it? And do you think this will be the medium-term option? And if so, would you go to more?
Did it work? I mean, okay, so people who weren't us, we're paying €700 a ticket. So it's a reasonable investment for a workplace. I should add a caveat there. I mean, it's something I'm often critical of, the mobility in a smart city conferences. They're often paid, and they're often about people talking, from more academics and OEMs and stuff, rather than the people that use the services. I'd like to see a bit more of that. Yes, it worked. I think they made a really good effort, and they made a good starting point. I think there's always room to improve. I think I would have liked to see a shorter day. That kind of, I think they did do the sort of 10 till 6. I think something like 10 till 2 or something is more realistic, with maybe other options. Can I give you an example? I did see when we go to Mobile World Congress and IFA and these conferences, there is a company called Showstoppers who do what they call historically it's an event put on for press, where people can startups and companies can set up a stall to show off what they're making or what have you, their product, and people can go there and as journalists and drink a lot of alcohol for free and ask people lots of questions and get interviews, and it's actually a really useful event. You get lots of really good ideas and see trends and stuff. Obviously that stuff is not the same. Yes, you can walk around a booth, but it's a bit sterile and it's not as convivial. You can't have a group of people asking questions together and go, what about that bit? Those kind of things. So what Showstoppers has been doing, to their credit, is basically they've been setting up small events where there's maybe, say, let's just say for the sake of argument, it might be wearable tech. They'll have 5 different people. So you go to, say, a Zoom call, what have you. They will do presentations. Then you have the option to go in sort of small groups and ask the people questions. So as a group, or you can obviously contact them privately. But it works very well, because firstly, it often you often just want to know a few things so that you can write something. You don't need to know their life story, because they should have, if they've got to this stage, they'll probably have a decent press kit anyway. But it gives you that chance to kind of check a few things, or to ask some stuff. And that's been I think they did a really good job with that. So I think we're going to see. I would like to see a bit more of that sort of stuff, because it's not just people pitching their idea, because we those pitching competitions and stuff, they get pretty painful after a while. Once you get through 10 people, you're like, oh God, when's it going to be over? They're all great ideas, but it's just, the style is quite tiring to focus on, I guess, even the short ones. So those kind of interactive things where people get to talk to speakers, I think we will see more kind of VIP options for conferences, where you can pay more and you get that, or you get the one-on-one.
I've seen that at a few dev events,
Or you get private content, or maybe you get tutorials or a day of training beforehand, things like that. So there's going to be some really good stuff coming out. And I mean, yes, you could do this stuff in person, and you might have a more memorable experience, but I think this is a good option. And so, yes, I do think that the hybrid conferences are the future. I know the 5G conference.
The long-term future, or just the medium term? Like, do you think some of the benefits will outlive the need? Or do you think as soon as we can, everyone will be back to what we did before?
I think they will see it as an additional business opportunity, so that it will be another way to make revenue. Because a lot of conferences are already live streaming on whether they're using Facebook or what have you, or YouTube. They're recording the videos for later. But by doing it this way, they can actually get people to pay for those tickets who might watch it later. That's a huge advantage. Secondly, they also have all the data on the people that attend. They get their contact details to pass on to the sponsors
what they have
speakers.
watched and what they attended.
Yeah, exactly. All that stuff is very rich data, very useful. If they're using the events in a good way, they should be doing exit surveys and and we know not everyone fills them out, but you get a little bit. That stuff is very helpful. So all this stuff gives you very good impact on, what people are watching, what they're, how long in a video they stop and they walk away. Like, when you're in a room and then the whole front row leaves at a conference, awkward. But when you're home, it's not such an issue. So, we're getting all these kinds of opportunities. So I think it will remain. Would I go again? Yes, absolutely. I think it was a good effort. I would probably go to less of it because I didn't need to physically be there.
I think that was always the case with those, even with IFA in normal times. We went to a lot of stuff that was not.
No, I mean, I would disagree.
I didn't need to see all those vacuum
when you
cleaners
go to the showrooms, you want to see the tech because sometimes watching a video is not the same as picking it up or, but we come to that anyway.
All right, Cate. This has been very interesting. Good to have you back. Just for anybody who wants to keep in touch with you, how can they get in touch with you? Do you have a website or social media or?
Yeah, I mean, I will post some links from our discussion today below the show notes and my contact details, of course. I'm quite active on LinkedIn and Twitter. LinkedIn is obviously my name. My Twitter handle is @Cate, which is CATE _Lawrence, LAWRENCE. And yes, I'll have that underneath because we know spelling names is a pain of everyone's day.
I had a rather embarrassing time where I mispronounced someone's name like 3 times yesterday. But anyway, let's.
I would add something to that, Chris. There is actually another tech journalist in Berlin called Chris Ward. So
it's a very common name, which is why I don't use it online so much. There's a Daily Express journalist called Chris Ward. It's actually extremely common, which is why I use the nickname Christian Schiller. I use a nickname for the opposite reason of many people, so people can actually find me.
True.
If you looked up Chris Ward, you would probably not find me. Okay, thank you very much for your time, Cate.
Welcome.
That was my interview with Cate Lawrence. I hope you enjoyed that. I have lots of things in progress. Nothing has really massively changed on the website at the moment, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes. I actually had a creative projects weekend, and I wrote the first few chapters of 2 new books, which obviously are not available yet. I also did some reorganizing of the website, which you cannot see yet. It is not live, but it is in progress behind the scenes. I spent a lot of time automating a lot of things. So a lot of my updates are going to get a lot quicker and more seamless moving forward. But you won't be seeing that quite yet. It's kind of waiting for these next few releases before they will start triggering. I did a Dexposé with the Microsoft Quantum Development Kit yesterday, so that should be on YouTube now. It hasn't come into the feed yet. And tomorrow, so Thursday of the week that this podcast is released, I will also be doing a solo adventurer with Alone Against the Flames, a solo version of Call of Cthulhu. And finally, the second episode of Board Game Jerk will be releasing today, I think. So it should be in the feeds already. That's our second episode. And we should be releasing the second episode of Stories About People, which you can currently see on my website preview here, next week. So lots of new things coming out over the coming weeks. I will have a few articles out this week as well on developer experience, sort of riffing off the live streams I've been doing. So you can also look forward to those. So until next time, thank you very much for joining me.